go for it. Go into any kind of career, even if you don't have that ecological education, and change that little culture from within. And that's just such a powerful moment.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm sitting here with my friend Toby Diggens, who's a landscape designer of increasing acclaim, one who is transforming and rewilding landscapes the length and breadth of Britain. Toby's someone who took his childhood love of nature and turned it into an incredibly successful career. And what's most interesting about Toby's work is the way that he weaves traditional, often migratory livestock farming patterns into his projects. For Toby, there is no conflict between livestock farming and rewilding. He considers livestock to be essential to the process of ecological recovery. Toby, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here.
Toby, can we just start with the story of how you came to do what you love on a full-time professional basis?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been a huge naturalist, and I spent my entire childhood growing up on the sort of wild North Norfolk coast, fishing and basically seeing some of the kind of, as far as I knew at the time, the last sort of proper wildernesses of the East Anglian coastline. And that sat really, really deeply with me. I then moved out to the States, and I was sort of kite surfing professional for a while. And I lived on Cape Hatteras National Seashore, which has the Gulf Stream weaving past it, which obviously is connected to us. And I studied marine biology up in Newcastle, staying close to the ocean again. And I think it was that connection to these massive systems that we were being taught about that stayed with me. When I started a business with the UK company Moneypenny, which is the sort of American version of Moneypenny, they do concierge telephone answering. I started to travel the US a lot, and I started to see the kind of impacts of sort of unmitigated expansion all over the place. And I'd been sheltered from that when I lived in Cape Hatteras, and I thought America was this just marvelous kind of wilderness. And it really inspired me to try and do something that went back to the roots, as it were, that went back to who I'd grown up being and what I'd learned at school. So I then trained as a landscape architect, and this is where we are now.
Do you remember that quote by Aldo Leopold, who said, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds, and much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to everyone else." I suppose that's kind of how I feel. I haven't had the same formal ecological education that you've had, but this has been my passion all my life. And while everyone's around me is kind of celebrating the beauty of a place, I'm often quietly or not so quietly thinking, my God, but it's a wreckage.
Yeah, I mean, Aldo, I just wish I'd lived to have shaken that man's hand. It's kind of a bit emotional almost talking about him, because he really did witness the last of an America that we don't know anymore. And there's an amazing book called Aldo Leopold's Odyssey, which was written by an academic reviewing, that tiny little book, a Sand County Almanac. And what they gleaned from it is just this genius, basically. And, he's an enormous inspiration of mine. And actually on our website, he is the leading quote of why we do what we do.
I didn't know that. So I love that link. Well, I thought of him as you spoke, and he went on to say, an ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. It's kind of a depressing quote. And of course, Aldo didn't live to see this rewilding movement that's growing up all over the world that we talk about on this podcast. And what I find interesting is, in talking to you, is that a lot of the people of our generation who loved nature and who were obsessed with all of these things didn't imagine that they could build a career in it. So some went and joined the National Trust or the Wildlife Trust, or perhaps traveled abroad to work for the Nature Conservancy or something. But the vast majority ended up in much more mainstream jobs, and their kind of romantic worldview was left to find expression during weekends or during their school holidays. Yeah. And so what was different with you? How did you imagine that you could turn this love of nature and this experience that you'd had growing up into a full-time career in which you are now kind of top of the game?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, just quickly on that, it is such a fascinating thing, because my dad would have done what I do were it not for the time of life or time of, the generations, as it were. And he was a massive inspiration about, the fact that if you really follow your heart, you can do incredible things. And I think you're absolutely right that today there is a huge opportunity to rotate out of, super intellectual jobs, which typically have had very little ecological improvement baked into their reality, and actually turn your hand to something truly kind of regenerative in any space.
In a way that wasn't true in the past. That's, I guess, partly because there is just a cultural shift underway in which people are recognizing to a much greater extent the importance of nature all around us, and people are yearning for a kind of reconnection. We see that everywhere, the kind of apps that people have, mindfulness revolution that's going on, open any newspaper or magazine, the stories about white storks in Sussex or beavers being, even the Daily Star had a big joke about how Keir Starmer's pro-beaver, on their front page week before last. So there's that. And then there's also this economic shift taking place in which the quantifiable kind of cold calculation of the value of nature is now being embedded in the mainstream. The value of a mangrove as a flood defense, as a nursery for tropical fish, or the value of a peat bog in terms of the carbon it sequesters and the floods that it mitigates. And therefore, those things coming together means that there are careers to be had in nature, which wasn't the case previously. So you were kind of an early sort of front runner of this story. And now I meet people every week in their early 20s who want to devote themselves to this and want to build a career in this. And it's starting to become a reality. So how did you then start your company? What was the idea?
So literally flying back from America, knowing that I wanted to become, in my eyes at the time, a landscape architect, I decided on the name Dig & Co. because, my last name's Diggins. And dig seemed, kind of pertinent because I was probably going to do a bit of digging, or at least I was going to be part of projects that meant there was going to be some digging and river restoration. Everything else was going to be fun. And I would just like to say that the & Co is because my way of thinking is that in a lot of cases, we have our name on things. And I wanted to make sure that the team that I've now built were represented in our brand name. So & Co is, obviously I had to think up something, but we've now got 7 other people, or 7 including me. And we work on, large scale nature restoration, nature recovery projects across the whole of the UK. And each one of them brings, an enormous amount of joy and a huge amount of satisfaction to, every single day that we're here. And that's really what I massively wanted, is you can get a lot of satisfaction in these quick hits, but I wanted to wake up every morning and go to work knowing that every time, I picked up a pencil, it was having a positive impact on the natural environment. That's literally the kind of core underpinnings of what we do.
I mean, it's sort of a young naturalist dream. I mean, it's definitely the dream that I had as a kind of young person in my 20s, early 30s was the idea that I could look at a landscape and envisage how it might be, put pen to paper. And that's what I've been doing at Canwood. It's been the joy of my life, is watching Canwood come back to life.
And it's amazing.
It's amazing. The nature reawakening there has been one of the most remarkable things I've ever been lucky enough to witness. And that's how you and I really got to know each other, was because you've been engaged on a big landscape recovery project, almost adjoining Canwood. Canwood, of course, is in the middle of Selwood Forest, a landscape that sits roughly between, say, Bath in the north and Wincanton in the south, and Frome in the east, and let's say Wells in the west. So maybe somewhere between 80 and 100,000 acre former mosaic of wet, willowy woodland. In fact, I learned recently that Selwood, now the word Selwood is derived from sallow, because sallow, of course, a hybridized willow. It would have been a willowy, oaky wood pasture, wet underfoot. And it was manorial wastes, land that the lords of the manor, the dukes of Somerset, the marquises of Bath felt was not worth farming. So people were permitted to turn their cattle out, turn their pigs out, and graze it extensively, gather fruit and fuel and cut turf and so on. And it was actually one of the last places in southern England to be enclosed by a series of very controversial acts in the kind of early to mid 19th century. And Selwood sits between the chalk downland, the great chalk downland, the kind of greater Stonehenge landscape to its east, and to the west you've got the birthplace of England, really, the Avalon, the Somerset Levels, what should be our Camargue, our kind of Danube Delta, which has been drained, and we've talked about the Somerset Levels in other episodes. And what's exciting is Landscape Recovery Project to my east kind of connects Selwood up into Salisbury Plain. And we've walked it together now on a couple of occasions. We've talked about it a lot. And what I thought was particularly wonderful in the way that you're considering this project is the way you've taken into account how the landscape's been used by people across the ages, and specifically the droving of livestock from the West Country, in some cases all the way from Cornwall, up through Wessex and all the way to London, and the way those livestock behaved and the impact they had on the local environment. Now, it's a way of life that no longer exists, but you can still see evidence of it. So I'd just love you to tell me that story again of mice and men. Tell me about the rabbits, please, Toby.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big story. It's just ecologically, it's fascinating. I've come to call a lot of the kind of habitats that we are involved in like migratory landscapes. So, our great uplands, in terms of when they were cultural landscapes, so after they were sort of taken away from being truly wild, where, the large apex predators were kind of managing the scene. And then obviously humans step in as another predatory element. And of course, what begins to happen is the domestication of livestock, which, I personally believe came at an enormous kind of injunction in our sort of generational knowledge, because I think we probably ended up hunting a lot of the wild game close to extinction, pushing ourselves further and further into more and more difficult terrain to find that protein, which was absolutely vital to us. And slowly but surely, of course, that domestication concept made a huge amount of sense, because essentially you've got the insurance policy of your livestock around you all the time. Now, that was so far beyond in terms of before any kind of inputs, no hay cutting, nothing. The only thing we could do was move our animals from place to place to find the best forage. And of course, inevitably, that will have followed the same logic as wilder herds, because there would have been natural migrations up onto Salisbury Plain. I read a thing about the Lincolnshire wolds, which was that the grassland uplands of the Lincolnshire wolds, which are calcareous, chalk grassland, just like Salisbury Plain, were essentially the breeding grounds for livestock. The mineral-rich grasses allowed the livestock to refresh themselves after calving or lambing, and the same would have happened with the wild herds. And these huge migratory landscapes will have played host to gigantic herds, both wild and managed by people over generations. And I think one of the things that I've come to learn is that actually in the fullness of history, like, we're really livestock people. We've had quite a difficult climate to grow crops in when you compare it to, slightly easier to grow habitat. I just went to India, stuff just grows everywhere. We have a really long winter. It used to be worse. And livestock, with the insurance, you could still milk through winter. You could still get eggs. You could still, find your meat. So we're a huge livestock nation underneath everything. And I don't know, for probably thousands of years, we managed landscapes incidentally that ended up being incredibly powerful for the natural system.
So what did that look like? Let's say kind of beginnings of the modern era, 500 years ago, 800 years ago. What did that look like in terms of, Wessex, where you and I both live, from Cornwall up towards, let's say, London?
Yeah, I think it would have been exceptionally geographically unique. So places like Salisbury Plain will have retained their kind of very open, but kind of grazed landscape features as you would see today. In smaller, tighter habitats, for example, where I live in Devon, you would have had the parish wastes, as you called them, the heaths, the culm grassland where things like marsh fritillary still live. But they'll have been pretty extensive areas of habitat which a completely manual labour force would have never been able to cultivate, which has been too difficult. And as a consequence, you'd have had this patchwork, often connected, of basically intact natural or semi-natural habitat, as people now call it. So it would have had a cultural level of management with those livestock, but because of the difficulty of cultivations, it would have been basically maintained since probably the Ice Age. And if there was any cultivation, it was often very, very short term. So there's this old saying down in Devon called Devonshiring, which was basically that you took a field to arable over a year of hard work with a mattock, team of 20 people. You basically open up the kind of peaty turf, burn that sod, put that back on the land, and you grow barley for a couple of years. And then it's so burnt out because the soil's so poor here, that you then let it revert back to species-rich grassland and go to grazing again. And of course, a huge amount of area wouldn't have been that. You add in the droving, and then people will have needed to have way markers where they could water and, pasture stock for a couple of days while they rested before they did another run. So you inevitably get, again, before inputs, this marvelous mosaic of essentially kind of really beautiful habitat, which I think only relatively recently was lost.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
So when those animals were stopped for 2-3 days in the landscape on their way, say, to London, I think you told me that those who were living and farming in those landscapes would have invited the livestock on to rest in order to fertilize their fields.
That's absolutely right, yeah. So quite a cool other story is that the Scots pine was a droving way marker. And so as you rounded the top of a hill with your 200 strong herd of collected cattle that came all out of the Cornish hills, you would look at a Scots pine and you would know, of course, that was where there was a pond or there was a watering hole or there was a river or there was an inn. And that was the kind of natural signpost, what a cool signpost. And yeah, basically, as the grazing season progressed through the summer, more and more and more pasture that was, right close to the edges of those droveways would have been used up by the stock being pushed. And so farmers invited the stock people in to say, you've got 100 head, go onto my arable land, have the cows crap all over it, puddle it up. What a great way of not having to get a load of manure out of the barn that, trust me, because I manage cattle, is, pretty heavy if you're doing it manually.
So what does that mean for trees in the landscape, say from Exmoor, where you are, all the way to, say, Salisbury Plain? Because if these landscapes were being regularly grazed by large numbers of drove livestock, does that leave scope for any scrub or trees? What does it look like?
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it? Probably it was quite a tree-less period, but you do always have to remind oneself that the trees are also being used for a lot of other things. So the grazing of new regeneration will have most likely been because of the fact that it had been used for other things like building, for mining. Sometimes there were calls from the manors and the lords for trees to go to making ships, for example. And I think from a kind of how the landscape ends up being how we know it, it's kind of a steady decay from the tree perspective. The woods that were worked hard for coppicing and proper forest production will have been essentially embanked to stop the stock getting in. And then out in the kind of the wastes, the commons, the chases, it probably was based on soil type as to whether you had quite quick regeneration or whether you had quite slow regeneration.
Because the conventional thinking has always been nature equals trees. You always used to hear when we were growing up, chancellors of the Exchequer saying, and we're going to allocate £1 million to tree planting in the north or whatever. And even when I arrived at Canwood in 2008-9, and we decided I'd set aside a corner, 20-25 acres of the farm for nature, the conclusion was we'll plant trees on it. But that thinking is outdated. So what is your view in terms of the value of these open drove landscapes versus those which are blanketed in trees?
I don't really have a preference. I don't have a bias towards open or closed landscapes. And I think when you come across landscapes, in terms of, I'm just thinking about the projects we do, it becomes very clear to us with the historic research that we do, whether those landscapes would have typically been more or less treed under varying, kind of management styles, whether it's fully wild or managed by people. And I think realistically nowadays, there are some landscapes, for example, like Salisbury Plain like some of the uplands that will have been so managed for so long under livestock regimes that probably a lot of the wildlife that is there is purely because of that cultural way of being. And inevitably what we see today, which is kind of fascinating, is that, as you say, the trend of, nature recovery, which often I think could be dressed up as nature recovery equals trees, is a bit just one-dimensional. And I really think that we need to be considering those migratory landscapes as bastions of really special biodiversity. Some things need exceptionally open landscapes to recolonize. The Brex, as a perfect example, has the stone curlew, a species which you don't find anywhere else except on steppe-like habitats across Europe. And the Brex used to be an arid, open heathland full of, heather and acid grassland. And of course, and the Brex mean breaks, which meant that cultivation could only occur for a couple of years before you had to literally let the soil restore because it was so lean, so sandy, so arid. And then you think, okay, well, that's just not the place for trees. A lot of people say it's it's our version of the Eurasian steppe. And so when you're contemplating the next steps for these landscapes as they become more nature rich again, you shouldn't let that go and just think trees equal nature.
So what about Dartmoor? I know you know Dartmoor pretty well. It's been subject to a big controversy during the last 2-3 years. And a lot of people think of Dartmoor as it should be rainforest, should be absolutely full of trees. There shouldn't be any grazing up there at all. And there are others who take a more nuanced view. But describe to me what the value that remains, ecologically speaking, on Dartmoor, and what your vision for Dartmoor would be if you had the power.
I mean, Dartmoor, we live really close to Dartmoor here. I can see it from my window. And actually we set the whole of our barn up to basically look at Dartmoor. And it is a fabulous piece of very unique, upland landscape. And I think there is literally room for both. That there is a huge amount of habitat area which could become temperate rainforest again. You've got these remarkable peatlands on the flat upland tops, the blanket bogs, which are miraculous, and the grazing system is equally something that could be, moved on progressively to become a real linchpin in Dartmoor's future explosion of ecological wealth once again.
What about the topic of winter grazing? Because we're told that that sheep all over Dartmoor all year round is the tradition, but I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure the moor can take it, can it? That winter grazing.
Well, I've looked into this, and there is a huge history of transhumance. So the process of long and short distance migration up to Dartmoor to enjoy the benefits of the kind of acid upland grassland, which will have been delivering minerals to cattle. And there are lots of amazing quotes from the 1700s of people noticing how their stock did so well when they put it up on Dartmoor. And if you think about how that's happened, it's well over 1,000 years of sort of transhumance system. And slowly but surely that has petered out to a much more sedentary nature of grazing. And it is that particular piece which I think is the linchpin to the explosion of life and to the recovery of species which are on the brink, like the curlew, which is being head started. People talk about windchat. Of course, there used to be black grouse. There's the odd red grouse knocking around, wheatear, ring-ouzel, dunlin, so many things that would be living up there in greater abundance if it was for a more ecologically appropriate grazing system, which probably ends up being quite akin to something that was done for 1,000 years just purely because it was useful for the farming communities of Devon.
So that's livestock up on the moor during the summer, cattle, sheep, horses in the appropriate number, but then the moor pretty much left to its own devices to heal during late autumn, winter, early spring. Yeah. And what about the landscape next to me, this bridge landscape between Selwood Forest and Salisbury Plain? You got asked to come in and look at a big landscape recovery project there. The ambition is sort of maximize habitat and nature, but you want to weave this culture of droving, this livestock culture, and all the ecological cascading effects that brings into the project. So how do you think about that in the modern era?
There are some issues like, the sort of the TB problem is something that can be a little bit of a a roadblock when it comes to sort of the unification of larger herds from multiple factions, which is really where that kind of transhuman system builds to be a really, really strong ecological benefit. Because I have a really strong respect for the work that Alan Savory's done with regards to holistic management, and I've seen firsthand and seen secondhand the amazing kind of recovery of grassland systems out in those arid or brittle landscapes. And realistically, we have such a strong correlatory nature to what needs to be done here. And it's about keeping animals on the move. It's about getting people back amongst those animals. A lot of people are talking, was it Florent Kaiser in one of your other podcasts, that really hit me, because he was saying, we want to stop going towards the AI stuff and the digital and get people back to feeling the landscape properly, and get thousands of people, planting those amazing upland Andean forests. And, that gave me goosebumps, because I really think we need people amongst livestock. The kind of the wealth of knowledge that I have learned since managing livestock for the last 6 years intimately, like they are literally part of our lives, like a family, is so incredible. And I just hope that people see that is something on offer for them. I hope that we can allow for that to become something, because to be out on those landscapes, to see the wildlife that's returning because of work that you're doing is wholly fulfilling. And that comes back to what we said at the beginning. That's what you and I feel so strongly. And I just love more and more people to feel that deep connection.
I put a post on social media last week saying that for anyone out there that's got savings or that has a house from which they might want to move, they should consider buying a little bit of land, with or without buildings, on which to restore nature. And I said this will bring them more joy than anything else that they can imagine. Of course, it was quite a controversial tweet, and a lot of people replied saying, well, people in food banks, your tweet is poorly worded. But I really mean it. And I'd love you to tell me a little bit about what you and your wife and family have done immediately around you where you live in Exmoor.
Well, yeah, I really couldn't agree more with your tweet. Of course, there's a nuance as ever with everything. But Bella and I moved to the barn that you can see behind me now, which we rebuilt, in totally natural materials. And we had this sort of desire that everything that we did on the land was going to have a powerful ecological positive. And we started from, essentially the kind of grasslands that you would find from an intensive dairy system. So very, very species poor, 1 or 2 types of grass. And we worked really closely with, friends, family, the Devon Wildlife Trust. Initially, when you're kind of, you are uninitiated when you enter these new landscapes, I was like, what's calm grassland? Now we're obsessed with it and spend all the time in the world going over it, looking at it, managing it. And suddenly I realized what Devon really was, not actually that long ago. And so we set out on the journey to basically do that. And we've chosen, as a smaller farm, it's now about 110 acres, which includes a BNG site, to really restore it for the grasslands initially. This is this journey we're on. So we've actually got, compared to conservation logic, quite a high stocking rate, purposefully, to get species richness back into the sward. And that is just exploding.
So BNG, of course, biodiversity net gain, that's the mechanism you used by selling biodiversity credits to raise the money to buy the land, which expanded your farm, of course.
Yeah.
And you said you want it to be like Devon was. Well, what was Devon like?
Gosh, it's a super kind of beguiling county, and especially the plateau that we're on. We're just off Exmoor. It's basically Exmoor, but we're just off the edge of it. We can see Exmoor, we can see Dartmoor, and there is this geology called the Culm Measures, which is this deep clay landscape. The rivers will have had millions of salmon running up them at one point in time. And then, of course, slowly but surely, as agricultural improvements have mainly drained our landscapes, the loss of, even if it was shallow, peaty, rich, porous, spongy soils, little combes and woodland gullies, which would have had rainforest in them. And then this patchwork kind of scrubland willow mosaic, much the same as Canwood, actually, much the same as yours. Tussocky, as well as then these sort of more open uplands, which once again will have, sported people's livestock in the summer, in the high summer when they were needing to cut hay on their home ground. So it would have been a fabulous place. And again, it's funny how you can restore land that's very recently been taken in a different direction. And it's very amazing how that land so quickly often returns faster than stuff that might have been cultivated for generations.
And the landscape surrounding you, I seem to remember, is pretty intensively managed. That electric green, year-round grass and quite tightly cropped hedges. It doesn't look enormously welcoming to curlews and other migrating birds that would, of course, have nested along that ridge in great abundance in the past. Yeah. How do your neighbours feel about what you're doing on your land? And how do they feel about you generally? Someone whose whole livelihood is about rethinking landscapes at scale and putting that into practice.
Yeah. I think just to directly quote a neighbour of ours, he was like, I really like that guy, Toby, but he doesn't think anything like me. And I was like, yeah, that's very true. He has a facility that, looks after animals, which it's called an AFU. So if they're sort of non-reactors for TB and stuff, they can still be managed to go into the food chain and that kind of thing. So it's all indoor. And so, there's an amazing kind of dichotomy between our farm and his. It's a really tough one. I think farmers are really struggling at the moment in general. And the whole livestock farming thing, there's a recent report that came out for the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. It showed how, livestock farming is one of the least profitable out there. And realistically, these landscapes can't really do much else. So then the opposing problem that we have now, which I've called surreptitious land abandonment, is we've got the AD plants. And those AD plants are, just about mechanized calorific value into a big anaerobic digester. And again, it's all a proportional thing. They're great on farm. They're brilliant if you've got, a lot of muck and you need to convert it into some sort of fertilizer, much better than buying stuff, from Italy or whatever, artificials. But the land take is vast. They can pay really good rents relative to what you could do as a livestockman. And I know livestock people in our area who have said that really they have kind of sucked a lot of the life out of the ability to kind of find good grazing because of the fact that, it's a totally mechanized system and you're just wanting 100% of what that land can offer to go straight into the AD. So that's an issue that we have locally. And I really, really hope that the penny drops soon, that you can't just keep throwing, millions and millions of gallons of this stuff on the land and for it not to go somewhere, it just goes straight into the rivers and obviously just churns off out to sea and is a massive problem for everybody downstream.
Toby, you're living your dream. You are transforming landscapes up and down the country. Your business is thriving. The project that I'm closest to is next door to me in Somerset, and I'm incredibly excited about it. What's your advice to someone, you or I get asked all the time, to meet young people who want to work in nature? What advice do you give young people who love rewilding in nature and they really want to devote themselves to it, but they don't quite know where to start?
I mean, firstly, I'm just completely baffled and excited by the next generation. So I have people in the studio who are, technically a generation below me now, and their commitment is beyond mine. I thought a bit like you, I was like, wow, when I met you, I was like, holy moly, this guy is fully committed. And it's so inspiring to be around committed people who want to do, great things for nature recovery, great things for, a whole natural functioning of ecosystems. And so I just say to people who want to get into it, get out there on the ground properly, embed yourself in it deeply, go and plant trees, go and restore rivers, go and sow a wildflower meadow, go and, work with people like us on, raising livestock and seeing what the realities of it are and seeing the touch points that you have to do and some of the stuff that is just old farming wisdom there's no need for anymore. You don't need to buy, especially if you've got good old breeds, you don't need to buy inputs to make them grow beautiful beef, for example. And so many of the linkages that I just love watching the penny dropping, and then you just say, and go for it, go into any kind of career, even if you don't have that ecological education and change that little culture from within. And that's just such a powerful moment. So yeah, have at it.
It feels such an exciting time in rewilding and nature conservation generally in the UK right now that there are careers to be had for people like Toby, who's become a rock star of our movement. And his work in particular, I think, is exciting because it integrates traditional agriculture going back millennia in this island with the dramatic and ambitious recovery of nature. I just love speaking to Toby. He's kind of a poet, really, and it's even better if you get to walk with him through the landscape. He points things out to you and so on. But if you enjoyed the conversation I had with Toby as much as I enjoyed making it, please give us a like or a review. And check out our new Rewilding the World YouTube channel and subscribe for snippets from behind the scenes and the best bits from past episodes and so on. Next time, I'm going to be talking about the illegal wildlife trade with Olivia Swart-Goldman from Wildlife Justice Commission. Olivia was previously at the International Criminal Court and is now devoting herself to tracking down and exposing wildlife criminals that are driving some of our most iconic species to extinction. The Wildlife Justice Commission is a little NGO that is punching way above its weight. They're doing some very daring, very brave, and very impactful work all around the world.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.